Political Theology and Biblical Atheism, Revisiting the Schmitt-Strauss Exchange in Weimar. The conservative and eventual National Socialist jurist Carl Schmitt famously asserts in The Concept of the Political that all genuine political philosophies are pessimistic concerning human nature. By relying extensively on Thomas Hobbes, a thinker who so strikingly illustrated the violent behavior of man to man in the absence of authority, Schmitt clearly assumes that he has grounded his state theory on a sufficiently pessimistic conception of human beings. Indeed, what could be more pessimistic than a theory like Schmitt's quote-unquote friend-enemy thesis, which insists on the centrality of human enmity to political life? Yet in his widely celebrated contemporary commentary on Schmitt's 1932 book, the young Leo Strauss insists that Hobbes's notion of man as dangerous but educable, a notion that Schmitt never fully rejects, is not sufficiently pessimistic to justify the kind of political philosophy that both Schmitt and Strauss seek as an alternative to liberalism. In the 20s and early 30s, Strauss sought a functional equivalent to traditional theocracy, a biblical atheism, as it were, that might serve as a foundation of political authority in a simultaneously post-theistic and post-Enlightenment age. Schmitt, for his part, sought an appropriately fascist, if not yet Nazi, solution to what he deemed to be liberal theory's hopelessly contradictory principles and liberal practices' painfully obvious inability to resolve the near Civil War circumstances of the late Weimar Republic. According to both Schmitt and Strauss, even though Hobbes deems man, quote-unquote, dangerous in circumstances where authority is absent, the Malmesbury philosopher affords the subjects of his Leviathan state significant freedom of thought and action on the assumption that individuals, when governed by a sufficiently strong state, can be prudent, educable, and capable of rational cost-benefit calculations that may prove conducive to public peace and stability. Schmitt thinks he can correct these flaws in the Hobbesian state by refounding it on collective rather than individual grounds. Strauss retorts that Schmitt's reformulation still permits too much freedom of conscience and behavior for state subjects. In relying on Hobbes, Schmitt may affirm the importance of quote-unquote sovereignty, but he eschews the necessity of, in Strauss's word, quote-unquote dominion. If Schmitt were to understand human evil in terms of, quote, moral baseness, unquote, or, quote, sinfulness, unquote, then, Strauss suggests, Schmitt would elaborate a more comprehensive notion of quote-unquote ruling than Hobbes countenanced or Schmitt himself articulates. Rather than correcting addressable flaws in Hobbes's system, Schmitt, by not clarifying his view of human nature, still allows essentially liberal freedoms to persist as dire threats to both the stability of the Leviathan state and to any substantive notion of the good life. Given the sinful, morally based character of human evil, Strauss insists that public order requires an authority more rigorous and intrusive than the sovereign state, an authority that imposes a substantive vision of the good life that cannot be derived from modern sources, whether early modern notions of natural right or what he calls elsewhere, quote, the execrable principles of 1789, unquote. Strauss suspects that Schmitt, a renowned Roman Catholic critic of liberalism, fundamentally agrees with him. Despite what he appears to say to the contrary, Schmitt must believe that human beings are inherently sinful. A perspective that understands sinfulness to entail moral baseness asserts that humans are driven to do wrong not by material deprivation or by the desire to satisfy bodily appetites, as liberals would have us believe. Rather, human beings take fiendish pleasure in doing precisely what they know to be wrong. They take supreme gratification by transgressing moral boundaries, by committing evil as such. Statutory law promulgated by the sovereign state cannot tame humanity's inherent sinfulness, nor can it cultivate the natural human intuition of goodness that necessarily accompanies the base human desire to violate it. My essay explores the place of educable versus sinful evil in the respective efforts of Schmitt and Strauss to develop genuinely authoritarian alternatives to liberal state theory in interwar Germany. Specifically, it addresses several of Strauss's readings of Schmitt on the moral cum theological status of the political, his assumptions concerning the extent to which Schmitt actually endorses a notion of human evil as sinfulness or moral baseness, his assertion that Schmitt deliberately hides the moral dimension of the political, and his mischaracterization of what Schmitt deems to be the ultimate danger confronting the political in their age. That is, whether Schmitt fears that the political will disappear altogether or merely be practiced dishonestly. Much more than his disciples admit, Strauss shared deep affinities with Schmitt's agenda in the concept of the political. By affirming the political, Schmitt celebrated the return of enmity as a harbinger of the reassertion of authority, the prospect that in the present moment a new post-liberal world order might arise afresh. Only a few years before, in 1929, Strauss expressed similar exhilaration at the return of sharp distinctions among different groups of people. The demise of the commitment to, quote, love thy neighbor, unquote, at the heart of Enlightenment philosophy, spelled for Strauss the return of moral affirmation and a revival of quasi-biblical authority. However, rather than a self-critical, quasi-universal, biblical tradition affiliated with the Hebrew prophets, Strauss exclaims, rather provocatively, quote, we must ask ourselves seriously whether perhaps the kings were right, unquote. In other words, Strauss turns to the biblical legacy to reaffirm the harsh necessities of warfare and rule, rather than the universal morality retrieved from the prophets by the assimilating liberals of the German Jewish Enlightenment. Schmitt's endorsement of National Socialism in 1933 makes clear the kind of authoritarianism he sought as a replacement to liberalism. Strauss's position, as conveyed by his writings of this era, is more elusive. I will therefore try to sketch out the kind of authoritarian alternative to liberalism, the kind of revived, pre-modern, quote, regime as regimen, unquote, that Strauss was formulating in his writings before his emigration to the United States. Schmitt intends the concept of the political to serve as a neo-Hobbesian attempt to rescue the state in the midst of its 20th century crisis. To Schmitt's mind, liberal theory and practice has undermined the unity, the integrity of the state, and put European nations, particularly Germany, back in circumstances similar to those that confronted Hobbes during the English Civil War. Schmitt seeks to return to the sovereign state the monopoly over the political that liberalism had wrested from it during intervening centuries. Schmitt famously insists that the political corresponds to the fact of human enmity, the factuality, the facticity of the eternal human propensity to make distinctions between friends and enemies. The political pertains to the existential reality that humans resort to mortal violence, lethal force, to make or sustain our friend-enemy dissociations, our us versus them groupings. According to Schmitt, the political sphere and the friend-enemy distinction stand independent of all other concepts and distinctions. The political is distinct from the aesthetic, the economic, the moral, and the theological spheres. human enmity is simply beyond good and evil in the moral realm. It exists independent of categories such as beautiful and ugly in the aesthetic realm. The enemy is simply the embodiment of an alternative, quote, different and alien, unquote, way of being, one that by virtue of its inherent otherness potentially threatens one's own. For Schmitt, even though the concepts that constitute the various spheres of human life stand independent of each other, they all may at some point become political. If people were to raise the possibility, the threat of deadly force in pursuit of any of these other distinctions, these other spheres would in fact convert into political spheres. If religious distinctions, economic distinctions, even theoretically, aesthetic distinctions, develop into potentially mortal distinctions among groups, then they are no longer strictly religious, economic, or aesthetic, but now primarily political. Thus, the political derives its content, its substance, from the potential for life-threatening violence posed by various human groupings, not from the specific issue over which that violence might be deployed. Schmitt lauds the Hobbesian state for stabilizing human expressions of the political in an historically unprecedented way. The sovereign state diffused domestic civil wars, and the Westphalian state system managed interstate conflict internationally. Nevertheless, Schmitt concedes that both the sovereign state model and Hobbes's philosophical formulation of it were flawed. They allowed the state to be undermined from within. As individuals surrender their subjective judgment over the use of lethal violence to the state, Hobbes granted them an ostensibly less volatile subjective freedom. Individuals are free to think whatever they like, so long as they do not act, and especially do not resort to violence on the basis of what they think. Freedom of conscience is soon followed by economic rights. In pursuit of commodious living, subjects have the right to engage in commercial exchange with, rather than armed conflict against, their fellow subjects. According to Schmitt, freedom of conscience and economic activity eventually threatened the state and upset the state-secured equilibrium of the political. Corrosive political dissent and disruptive class conflict are the inevitable results of such freedoms. Schmitt thinks he solves these problems by replacing Hobbes's individualism with a revived and radicalized version of Aristotelian social solidarity. Schmitt revives, albeit in a morally neutral way, the notion that human beings naturally gravitate towards some sort of community, a notion that Hobbes, in many ways, sought to dissolve. The predisposition of some groups of humans to live together according to specific ways of life allows Schmitt to postulate an unassailable collective existence of humans congregated around those specific forms of life. These spontaneously formed, fighting collectivities transpose to state authority something more existentially vital and socially binding than could the self-interested individuals who contract their way out of Hobbes's natural condition. But Schmitt willfully resists any moral assessment of the particular substance that brings a specific collectivity together, or, conversely, of the particular grounds on which they fight other collectivities bound by some other organizing substance. Schmitt will not even supply an account of the mechanisms, moral or not, that bring people together to begin with, and that keep them together. That is, he ignores what we conventionally understand as politics. Leo Strauss detects something odd in Schmitt's claim that the political stands independent of other conceptual spheres, especially the moral sphere. He cites Schmitt's Political Theology, published a decade earlier, where Schmitt asserted that, quote, the core of the political idea is the morally demanding decision, unquote. Indeed, in that earlier text, Schmitt emphatically affiliates the moral and the theological with the political. Strauss attributes the quote-unquote disharmony between the two texts, separated by a decade, to a polemical intention on Schmitt's part, a desire to keep hidden below an amoral exterior a deeply moral motivation. Strauss identifies a peculiar anxiety pervading the work, namely, Schmitt's fear that the political might disappear altogether, and his worry that this disappearance would have catastrophic moral consequences for humanity. If liberalism were successful in establishing a perpetually peaceful world of commercial exchange, or Soviet Russia a universal workers' paradise, then something morally valuable about humanity would be lost. Strauss asserts that, for Schmitt, a world without anything sufficiently important to kill and die for is a world in which nothing is important or serious. However formidable his critique, I submit that Strauss overstates certain aspects of Schmitt's argument. Specifically, whether Schmitt really fears that the political will disappear, and whether Schmitt's separation of the political from the moral is merely polemical. In other words, whether Schmitt feels obliged to hide his moral intentions in the text. On the first point, Schmitt provides ample evidence in both the main text of the concept of the political and in the appended neutralizations lecture, which Strauss himself cites, that liberal and communist states, their universalistic ideologies notwithstanding, will continue to behave politically. That is, they will continue acting in ways that both identify and mortally threaten enemies. For instance, the way Schmitt describes French revanchist behavior in a crucial footnote of the concept of the political, and Russian geopolitical motivations throughout the neutralizations essay, suggests that he believes that there is virtually no danger that the political will disappear from the face of the earth. On the second point, that Schmitt is consciously hiding the moral status of the political, Strauss may be at a disadvantage for which he cannot be criticized. Strauss could not know that there is a substantive reason for the fact that Schmitt's works from the early 20s, like Political Theology, are not, quote, in harmony, unquote, with the argument of the concept of the political. He likely did not know that Schmitt had been excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church when he remarried without an annulment in 1926. On the basis of this fact, it is quite plausible that Schmitt may have been deliberately and sincerely trying to reorient his ideas accordingly. To be sure, moral presuppositions pervade Schmitt's argument in favor of the political, but they may be unconscious and unintentional, and they certainly do not concern the prospect of the political's disappearance. The moral question of the concept of the political is not that the political will disappear. Rather, Schmitt exhibits alarm that the Allies and the Russians are practicing the political from an overtly anti-political ideological standpoint, which has serious consequences for how war is and will be conducted in the present and in the near future. Since their adversaries, especially Germany, are cast in an increasingly moralized light as monsters and not mere enemies, Schmitt argues wars will be fought even more viciously and inhumanely than was the Great War of 1914. Consequently, Germany, Mitteleuropa, may disappear, but the political will abide. In this light, Strauss may be correct in suggesting that Schmitt has not completely abandoned morality, but I would cast the moral character of the work differently than Strauss does. To wit, the state itself seems to carry much greater moral weight for Schmitt in the concept of the political than does the possibility of killing that Strauss consistently emphasizes in his comments. Therefore, one ought to press Schmitt on the question of morality differently than Strauss did. One should ask, for instance, by what standard, what criterion, other than a moral one, can Schmitt claim that the political is better managed domestically and internationally by the Hobbesian state and the Westphalian state system. Again, Schmitt overtly claims that the political should not be evaluated or governed by moral notions of good or bad, better or worse. The political should just be. In an ostensibly moral neutral way, Schmitt leaves these matters entirely to the judgment of the respective combatants engaged in existential struggle. Then why should he care whether the political is operationalized efficiently or inefficiently? That is, in ways that shed less rather than more blood. If his claim is that the early modern state system better institutionalizes the political than do nomadic, feudal, or imperial arrangements, that the state best quells civil war at home and forestalls total war abroad, doesn't this assume that less killing is a good thing, that less killing is morally right? For that matter, on what grounds does Schmitt imply that a victorious combatant should permit their defeated opponent to, quote, retreat back into their borders, unquote? Why shouldn't the victor, on existential grounds, pursue the vanquished until the latter are eliminated, indeed exterminated? If this is an accurate depiction of the latent moral underpinnings of Schmitt's book, then the order provided by the state clearly takes normative precedence over the facticity of the political, in Schmitt's estimation. On these grounds, Schmitt ought to affirm, morally, the Hobbesian state, which secures morally good outcomes, over the political, which may manifest itself in the most atrocious ways, most notably through genocide. In the text, Schmitt expressly prefers less, not more blood, contained rather than total war, mercy toward the vanquished. But his definition of the political, qua political, sets no such limits when collectivities act on the friend-enemy distinction. In his 1938 book, The Leviathan in the State Theory of Thomas Hobbes, Schmitt, now a discredited Nazi, returns to a theological rather than a purely secular, purely political reading of Hobbes's Leviathan. When explaining the collapse of the Hobbesian state, which he still considers to be the pinnacle of political theory and practice, Schmitt assigns to, quote, the Jewish philosopher, unquote, Spinoza, the central role in an esoteric passion play. Schmitt posits Hobbes's absolutist state as a quote-unquote mortal God that was betrayed by Spinoza on behalf of, quote, his own Jewish people, unquote, with dramatically detrimental consequences for Christian Europe. As Strauss dared him to do, but in ways that he could have scarcely imagined, Schmitt now reaffiliates the moral, the theological, and the political in his defense of Hobbes, with a vengeance. According to Schmitt, the God-become-man Leviathan state came to earth in order to bring peace and security to humanity. This mortal God asked its subjects not only to exchange obedience for protection, but also to believe genuinely that, quote, Jesus is the Christ, unquote. Because he did so, Hobbes cannot be blamed for turning the Leviathan into a morally neutral and hence potentially oppressive totalitarian state. Perhaps in response to Strauss's Hobbes book of 2 years before, Schmitt takes great pains to demonstrate that the Leviathan, created by vulnerable human beings in the natural condition, is more than simply the sum of the wills and the sum of the fears of these newly submissive political subjects. There is, Schmitt insists, a thoroughly theological, transcendental substance to the mortal God that cannot, as Strauss claimed in his book, be neutralized merely by the fact that it was created by individual conscience and individual consent. Unfairly, in fact quite cruelly, misusing aspects of the exiled Strauss's Spinoza book of 1930, Schmitt here blames that quote-unquote liberal Jew, Spinoza, for initiating the fateful demise of God on earth, the sovereign state. Spinoza, who could not accept the doctrine of the Incarnation, used the qualified subjective freedom of conscience permitted by Hobbes to turn particularist societal forces against the unity of what was fundamentally a Christian state, all in the subversive interests of assimilating Jews. According to this narrative, Spinoza and the Jews effectively re-crucify divinity incarnate, the Leviathan state, on the cross of private conscience, unleashing chaos and disorder on the Christian world in the form of the Enlightenment, the Age of Revolutions, world wars, and even at the deepest levels of the text, the mechanically oppressive and abusive Nazi state itself. The Jews, not Hobbes, and certainly not Schmitt himself, the Plettenberg jurist so reprehensibly intimates, are ultimately responsible for the eventual emergence of the Third Reich. After the war, even when the horrors of the Holocaust had been exposed to the entire world, Carl Schmitt, who so enthusiastically supported the Third Reich, still quite chillingly declared, "Really, the assimilated Jew is the true enemy." History, experience, and prudence may have compelled the mature Leo Strauss in his post-war writings to fundamentally change his youthful criticisms of liberalism. Schmitt, for his part, clearly proved impervious to learning of any kind. Thank you.